My name is Abigail Perez. I'm 28 years old, and when they called it luck, I called it a test I didn't ask for. One signature made me an heiress. One stranger at our table tried to make me a placeholder. And tonight, the truth will choose a side. They called it luck. I called it a test I didn't ask for. That's exactly what happened when my late mentor, Margaret Chen, left me her construction company worth millions. Margaret had no children, and I'd worked beside her for 6 years, learning every blueprint, every budget line, and every hard lesson she'd earned in 40 years of building. The folder arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick with legal papers and heavier than gold, and suddenly people who barely knew my name started calculating my worth. If you've ever been told to be grateful while someone reached for what's yours, hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what I'm about to share might just save you from the trap I almost fell into. Have you ever inherited something that changed not just your bank account, but the way people looked at you? Within 48 hours of the news going public, my older sister Rachel brought her new husband, Derek Hammond, to my apartment unannounced. Derek was charming in that corporate way, firm handshake, expensive cologne, teeth too white to trust, and he'd married Rachel only 8 months earlier after a whirlwind romance. "You're so lucky, Abby," Rachel kept saying, her smile tight around the edges, while Derek studied my living room like he was measuring it for new furniture. Behind their congratulations, I heard something else, doors unlocking that I never opened, plans forming that didn't include asking my permission. They stayed for 2 hours, and Derek spent 90 minutes of it talking about opportunities and smart management and keeping wealth in the family. My gut started screaming the moment Derek pulled out his laptop and opened a presentation. Yes, an actual presentation, titled Perez Hammond Holdings, A Family Vision. He talked about synergy like it was perfume, strong at first, cheap by morning, and impossible to wash off once it settled into your skin. Every slide had my company's name attached to his. Every projection assumed I'd already said yes to something I didn't even understand yet. "Let's manage it as a family," he said, drawing a net and calling it a hug, his hand resting on Rachel's shoulder like she was a prop in his pitch. I smiled, nodded, and said I needed time to think, but inside, my gut had already translated his words into something much clearer. Sign here, lose slowly, wake up one day, and wonder where it all went. Over the next 2 weeks, Derek didn't just pitch once. He orchestrated an entire campaign, and Rachel became his messenger whenever he couldn't be there himself. Family dinners suddenly had agendas, coffee meetups came with printed documents, and every conversation somehow circled back to protecting your future and maximizing potential. He talked about bringing in his financial advisor, restructuring the company hierarchy, and creating a joint LLC that would shield assets while giving him signing authority on major decisions. If you're watching this and thinking, wait, that sounds like he's taking over, go ahead and smash that like button and subscribe, because you're absolutely right, and I almost missed it too. Have you ever had someone rewrite your story while pretending they're just helping you edit it? Let me know in the comments, because that's exactly what Derek was doing, one helpful suggestion at a time. What made it so dangerous was how reasonable he sounded. Derek had 15 years of corporate finance experience, an MBA from a respected school, and a vocabulary that made confusion sound like sophistication. He'd lean forward, lower his voice like we were co-conspirators, and say things like, "Abby, you're brilliant at the work, but the business side will eat you alive without the right infrastructure." Rachel would nod along, adding, "He just wants to help, Abby. We're family." But every helpful suggestion came with fine print. His name on accounts, his people in key positions, his authority superseding mine whenever he deemed it financially prudent. The net he cast looked like opportunity from a distance, but up close, every rope had his initials woven into it. The breaking point came during a dinner at their house when Derek slid a contract across the table between the main course and dessert, literally used my sister's pot roast as a setup for a hostile takeover. The document appointed him as chief financial officer and co-decision maker of Chen Construction, now renamed Perez Hammond Development Group, without anyone asking me. My hands shook as I read it, not from fear but from rage so pure it felt cold. Rachel touched my arm and whispered, "Just look it over, Abby. It's what Margaret would have wanted, keeping it in the family." But Margaret had chosen me, not us, and that distinction suddenly felt like the only lifeline I had left. I smiled, folded the contract, put it in my purse, and said I'd have my lawyer review it. And that's when Derek's charm finally cracked, just for a second, and I saw what lived underneath it. I didn't argue after that dinner. I documented, labeling patterns like storm paths on a weather map, tracking every conversation, every email, every text message that tried to rewrite my boundaries. I created a folder on my laptop called After the Rain, and filled it with screenshots, recorded voicemails, in a one-party consent state, thank you very much, and a timeline that showed how Derek's suggestions escalated from helpful to demanding in just under 3 weeks. Every "let's just sign this quickly" went into that folder. Every "don't you trust family" got time-stamped and saved. If this resonates with you, if you've ever been made to feel crazy for protecting what's yours, hit that subscribe button and stay with me, because the quiet strategy I'm about to share changed everything. Do you keep records when something feels off, or do you try to give people the benefit of the doubt? I'd love to hear your approach in the comments. Proof isn't petty. Proof is peace. And that became my mantra during those weeks when Rachel called me paranoid and Derek called me overly emotional about business. I learned to say less in person and document more in private. I'd nod during their pitches, take notes they assumed were agreeable, and then immediately after each meeting, I'd write a follow-up email summarizing what was said and what I was agreeing to, which was nothing. Those emails served two purposes. They created a paper trail, and they forced Derek to either confirm his real intentions in writing or backtrack publicly. He started backtracking, and that told me everything I needed to know. When someone's plan requires your confusion, clarity becomes your weapon, and I sharpened mine with every saved receipt and every documented conversation. The most important thing I documented was what Derek didn't know I'd found: a series of LinkedIn messages between him and a commercial developer named Victor Sutton, discussing acquisition targets and undervalued inherited assets, with timestamps from 2 weeks before Margaret's will was even read. Derek had been planning this before he knew for certain I'd inherit, which meant he'd married Rachel with at least one eye on what she might give him access to. I printed those messages, locked them in a safe deposit box, and made copies for 3 different people I trusted. My hands didn't shake anymore when Derek called or when Rachel showed up crying about family falling apart. I had walls now, and walls remember who built them, and more importantly, walls remember who's trying to climb over them uninvited. The woman who built this from one key and a ledger taught me stillness is a strategy. Margaret Chen didn't raise her voice in 40 years of construction, but contractors twice her size would go quiet when she walked onto a job site. 3 days after Derek's contract stunt, I drove to Margaret's lawyer, Patricia Owens, a woman in her 60s who'd known Margaret since they were both 25 and broke. Patricia poured coffee in her oak-paneled office, slid a box across her desk, and said, "Margaret told me if anyone ever came after what she left you, I should give you this." Inside were 3 leather notebooks filled with Margaret's handwriting, every deal she'd ever navigated, every partner who'd tried to cheat her, and every strategy she'd used to protect what she built. If someone's trying to take what you've earned and you need practical strategies, not just anger, hit that like button and subscribe. This next part might give you a framework that saves everything you've worked for. Have you ever had a mentor whose words became louder after they were gone? That's what those notebooks became for me. A compass when the map had been stolen. One entry from 1987 stopped me cold. A man named Richard married my bookkeeper, spent 6 months learning our systems, then tried to dissolve the company and auction the equipment. I didn't yell. I built a file. Walls remember who built them, and so do contracts. Margaret had included copies of everything: the contracts Richard tried to forge, the timeline of his manipulation, and the legal response that ended with a restraining order and him leaving the state. She'd written in the margin, "Stillness isn't weakness, Abby. It's a strategy. Let them think you're confused while you're actually just collecting." Patricia watched me read and said, "Your Derek isn't original. He's a remake of every opportunist who ever mistook patience for permission." We spent 4 hours that afternoon mapping my situation against Margaret's notes, and for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone or crazy. I felt armed. We created what Patricia called an exit architecture, a step-by-step plan that didn't rely on confrontation, but on documentation, legal boundaries, and strategic silence. Every conversation with Derek going forward would be recorded or witnessed, every financial document locked behind attorneys and trustees, and every access point to the company secured with succession clauses that required board approval for any changes. Margaret had built those protections into the will, but I'd been too overwhelmed to understand them. Now Patricia walked me through each firewall like we were touring a fortress I'd inherited but never explored. The plan wasn't about revenge. It was about making it so expensive, legally complicated, and publicly embarrassing for Derek to continue that he'd have to walk away on his own. Margaret had written on the last page of the notebook, "Don't fight them in their arena. Build a better building and let them wear themselves out trying to knock it down." 2 weeks later, I invited Derek to meet me. Not at Rachel's house, not at my apartment, but at a cafe downtown at 2 in the afternoon on a Wednesday, surrounded by witnesses, with my phone recording in my purse and Patricia's paralegal at a table 10 feet away. Derek showed up in a suit, all teeth and confidence, carrying another folder, probably another version of the contract I'd never signed. He ordered an espresso, leaned back and said, "I'm glad you're ready to move forward, Abby. Rachel's been worried about you." I slid a single piece of paper across the table, a formal letter from Patricia's firm, outlining that I was declining all partnership proposals and that any future business discussions needed to go through my attorney. His smile didn't move, but his eyes did. They went from friendly to calculating in the time it took him to read 3 sentences. "This isn't about love, Derek. It's about control dressed as care," I said, keeping my voice level, my hands steady on my coffee cup. "You've made 17 attempts in 4 weeks to gain signing authority over a company you didn't build, using my sister as a messenger and family as leverage." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The truth was loud enough, and the cafe was quiet enough that I knew he wouldn't risk a scene. He started to speak, stumbled, then tried charm. "Abby, you're misunderstanding my intentions. I just want to help." I smiled, small, sad, final, and said, "I'm sure you do. Through my attorney only, moving forward. Enjoy your espresso." I stood up, left a 20 on the table, and walked out while my legs still worked, because they were shaking so hard I thought I might fall, but I didn't. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and cried for 10 minutes straight, not from sadness, but from the sheer adrenaline of finally saying no out loud. Patricia called it a boundary with teeth, a moment where silence stops working and clarity has to cut through. And she'd been right about the location, the timing, and the witness. Derek couldn't twist my words later because there were strangers who'd seen a calm conversation, and he couldn't claim I was emotional because I'd handed him a legal document instead of shouting. The paralegal texted me a photo of Derek sitting alone at the table for 20 minutes after I left, staring at the letter, his jaw tight, his phone out, probably calling Rachel, probably spinning the story, but it didn't matter anymore because I'd drawn a line in ink, not sand. That night, Rachel called me 8 times. I didn't answer. She texted, "How could you embarrass him like that?" I replied, "I didn't embarrass him. I just stopped letting him embarrass me." She didn't text back, and the silence that followed felt like the first full breath I'd taken in a month. The week after the cafe confrontation, Derek's mask didn't just slip, it shattered, and the pieces fell in public. My former colleague at Chen Construction, James Torres, called me on a Friday night and said, "I think you need to know something." Derek had approached him 3 weeks earlier, before I'd even declined the partnership, offering him a consulting position in the new management structure, and asking detailed questions about project budgets, client contracts, and vendor relationships. James had thought it was premature but harmless, until Derek started asking which employees might be open to transition if current leadership proved difficult. That phrase, "current leadership proved difficult," meant me, and Derek had been recruiting my own team before he'd even secured access to the company. If you've ever discovered someone was working against you while smiling to your face, drop a like and subscribe, because what I found next confirmed he wasn't just opportunistic, he was methodical, and he'd done this before. Have you ever had someone systematically try to dismantle something you built? Share your story in the comments. I need you to know you're not alone in this. James wasn't the only one Derek had approached. Over the next 72 hours, 3 more employees came forward, along with 2 vendors who'd received exploratory calls about whether they'd be willing to work under new management terms. Derek had built a shadow organization inside my company, complete with promises of promotions, salary increases, and equity opportunities once the transition was complete. The thing about whispers is they travel, and the thing about small industries is everyone knows everyone. One vendor had worked with Margaret for 20 years and called Patricia's office directly to report what felt like a hostile takeover attempt. I learned to follow soundless things after that. Timestamps on emails, patterns in phone logs, tiny inconsistencies in stories that didn't align when you laid them side by side. Derek had been busy, but he'd also been sloppy, because confidence makes people careless, and he'd never considered that loyalty to Margaret might outlast her. The most damaging evidence came from an unlikely source, Rachel herself, though she didn't mean to provide it. During one of her tearful phone calls about how I was tearing the family apart, she accidentally revealed that Derek had taken out a loan against their house 3 months earlier, before Margaret had even passed away, telling the bank he was securing capital for a major business acquisition. That timeline made my blood run cold. Margaret died in February, Derek married Rachel in June, and he'd taken out the loan in November. He'd been planning this for almost a year, long before he had any guarantee I'd inherit anything. I hired a private investigator, something I never thought I'd do, and what came back was a file 2 inches thick. Derek had approached 2 other widows in the past 5 years, both with family businesses, both situations ending in settlements sealed by NDAs. He wasn't just opportunistic, he was a pattern, a profession, a predator with a business model, and my sister had been the key he needed to unlock my inheritance. Armed with everything I'd gathered, James's testimony, the vendor reports, the investigator's file, and Rachel's accidental confession about the loan, Patricia and I designed what she called controlled detonation. We would give Derek exactly what he thought he wanted. One more chance to pitch his partnership. One final dinner where he could present his vision. Except this time, the audience wouldn't be just me and Rachel. I sent the invitation through Rachel, keeping my tone conciliatory, almost apologetic. I've been thinking about what Derek said, and maybe I was too hasty. Can we have dinner next Friday at my place? I want to hear his full plan. Rachel called me crying with relief, saying Derek was so happy I was finally being reasonable. The bait was set, and they swallowed it whole, because people who are used to winning stop checking for hooks. I spent that week preparing my apartment like it was a courtroom, because in a way, it was. Patricia would be there, introduced as a family friend, but actually recording every word as my attorney. James Torres would stop by unexpectedly as a former colleague saying hello. Margaret's oldest business partner, Frank Chen, her late husband's brother and a man Derek had never met, would arrive for dessert as someone who'd known the company for 40 years. The dining table was set with Margaret's china, polished silver, and 3 identical folders placed face down at strategic positions, one at my seat, one at Patricia's, one at Frank's. I even made Derek's favorite meal, which Rachel had mentioned once: braised short ribs, roasted potatoes, a bottle of wine that cost more than it should, because the theater of comfort makes people careless, and I needed Derek careless, confident, and talking. They arrived 15 minutes early, Derek in a suit despite my insistence that it was casual, Rachel in a dress I'd never seen before, both of them wearing the tight smiles of people who think they've already won. Derek handed me flowers, kissed my cheek, and said, "I'm so glad we're doing this, Abby. Family should work together." He'd brought his laptop, his folders, even a small projector. He'd prepared a presentation, which meant he'd never doubted for a second that I'd cave under enough pressure and enough time. We made small talk through appetizers, Rachel chattering nervously about work and weather, Derek steering every conversation back to vision and legacy and what Margaret would have wanted. Then, right as I served the main course, Patricia arrived. Then James. Then Frank. And Derek's face, the exact moment he realized the table had more people than he'd planned for. That's when I knew the trap had closed. And he felt it too. But by then his laptop was already open, his presentation was already loaded, and backing out would look worse than going forward. Derek went through with his presentation. 23 slides about synergistic growth, integrated management structures, and family legacy preservation. And I let him finish every word because rope works best when people tie their own knots. He talked about restructuring the board, bringing in his financial team, and creating a holding company that would, conveniently, require both our signatures for any major decision, which meant he'd have veto power over the company Margaret spent 40 years building. Rachel watched him with something between pride and nervousness, and I watched the room, Patricia taking notes, James's jaw getting tighter with each slide, Frank's face settling into the kind of calm that comes right before storms. When Derek finally closed his laptop and said, "So, Abby, what do you think? Are you ready to move forward as a family?" I smiled, reached for one of the folders on the table and said, "I think it's my turn to present." I didn't stand up. I didn't need to. The folder did the work. Inside were printed copies of the LinkedIn messages between Derek and Victor Sutton, time-stamped and highlighted, discussing inherited asset acquisition strategies and family access points weeks before Margaret's will was read. There were bank records showing Derek's loan against Rachel's house, taken out before Margaret died, with business acquisition capital listed as the purpose. There were sworn statements from James and 2 other employees about Derek's recruitment attempts, his promises of positions in a new structure, and his questions about which staff might be flexible under transitional leadership. And finally, there was the investigator's report, 2 pages summarizing Derek's pattern with 2 other widows, 2 other family businesses, 2 other situations that ended in legal settlements and restraining orders. The room didn't explode. It imploded, which is quieter but more final. Rachel's face went white, then red, then white again as she read the messages where Derek discussed her as an access point and their marriage as strategic positioning. Derek started talking, fast, defensive, pivoting between, "This is out of context," and "I can explain," and "Abby, you're misunderstanding." But Frank cut him off with a single sentence. "Son, I've seen this play before. And it never ends with the curtain call you're expecting. Patricia placed a second document on the table. A restraining order, pre-filed and ready for signature, barring Derek from contacting me, entering company property, or approaching any Chen Construction employee. James added quietly, "You called me 3 times, Derek. You offered me 20% more salary to report on Abby's decisions. I recorded the second call." The net they'd cast folded back like a curtain, and underneath was just a man who'd mistaken patience for permission and stillness for weakness. Rachel left first, stood up without a word, grabbed her purse, and walked out of my apartment while Derek was still trying to construct sentences out of broken explanations. I heard her car start in the driveway, heard her tires on gravel, and I knew in that moment that I'd lost my sister, at least for now, because the truth had arrived in a folder instead of a conversation. And some people never forgive the messenger even when the message saves them. Derek tried a different approach after she left. Anger, which was at least more honest than charm, saying I'd sabotaged his marriage, humiliated him, and ruined everything over paranoia. Frank stood up then, all 6'2" of him, and said, "You tried to steal a dead woman's legacy using her protege's sister as a key. The only thing ruined here is your credibility, and you did that yourself. You've got 60 seconds to leave before I call the police and make this a trespassing charge." The last envelope wasn't a threat. It was a boundary with teeth, and I handed it to Derek as he grabbed his laptop and his folders with shaking hands. Inside was a formal notice from Patricia's firm. Any further attempt to contact me, approach the business, or interfere with company operations would result in immediate legal action, including publicizing the investigator's full report and the pattern it revealed. "Your choice," I said, my voice steadier than my hands. "Walk away quietly, or have this become public record in 3 states where you've operated. Reputation is loud. Integrity is patient. Guess which one outlives the other." Derek's face did something I'd never seen before. Collapsed, like a mask made of paper meeting water. And he left without another word, his footsteps heavy on my stairs, his car door slamming hard enough to rattle my windows. I stood in my doorway and watched his taillights disappear, and the building didn't change in that moment, but the Guardians did, because I finally understood I was one of them. The aftermath was quieter than the confrontation, which surprised me. I'd expected lawsuits, social media wars, family interventions, but what I got was silence. Derek and Rachel moved to another state within 6 weeks. I heard through distant cousins that they'd separated within 6 months, though I never confirmed it because by then it wasn't my story anymore. The employees Derek had approached stayed loyal, and 3 of them eventually told me they'd reported his calls to each other before James came to me, which meant I'd had backup I didn't even know existed. Chen Construction grew by 18% the following year, and I renamed one of our scholarship programs after Margaret, funding young women in construction management. Not luck, not revenge, just readiness, meeting opportunity, and remembering who built the walls. If this story spoke to the part of you that's tired of being told to be grateful while people reach for what's yours, leave a like, share your story in the comments, and keep watching. Because the lesson here isn't about being cold. It's about knowing the difference between boundaries and bridges, and which one you need in the moment someone mistakes your kindness for a door they can walk through uninvited. The hardest lesson wasn't about Derek. It was about Rachel, and the silence that followed that dinner became louder than any argument we'd ever had. She didn't call for 3 months, didn't answer when I reached out, and when mutual family members tried to mediate, she told them I'd chosen a company over family, as if protecting what Margaret built was somehow a betrayal of blood. What she couldn't see, or wouldn't see, was that I'd actually protected her too, because Derek's plan had her house, her credit, and her future tied to schemes that would have collapsed and left her holding the legal consequences. Reputation is loud, integrity is patient. Guess which outlives the other, and guess which one I chose when the room demanded I pick a side. I slept through the night for the first time in years after that dinner, not because I'd won something, but because I'd finally stopped apologizing for having boundaries that other people found inconvenient. The company didn't just survive, it grew. And that growth felt like proof that Margaret's choice hadn't been luck. It had been trust earned through 6 years of showing up, learning, and respecting what she'd built. We expanded into sustainable construction, hired 12 new people in 18 months, and I established the Margaret Chen Leadership Fund, a scholarship for young women in construction management, particularly those from immigrant families like Margaret's had been. Every scholarship recipient gets one of Margaret's notebooks, digitized and printed, with her strategies, her lessons, and her reminder that stillness isn't weakness and documentation isn't paranoia. Some of those women have written to me about their own Dereks, bosses, partners, family members who mistook their patience for permission. And every letter reminds me that this story isn't about revenge. It's about readiness and teaching others that the walls you build to protect your peace are just as important as the buildings you construct to leave a legacy. As for Derek and Rachel, I heard they separated, reconciled, separated again, and eventually divorced, though I only know because my mother mentioned it once during a holiday dinner 2 years later. Rachel reached out on my 30th birthday with a text that said, "I'm sorry I didn't listen. You were right." And we met for coffee 3 weeks later in a conversation that was awkward, painful, and necessary. She told me Derek had done it before, not just the inheritance schemes I'd documented, but smaller manipulations throughout their marriage, financial decisions made without her input, control dressed as care until she didn't recognize her own bank account. We're rebuilding now, slowly, with boundaries that didn't exist before, and honesty that's uncomfortable but real. Inheritance isn't a prize. It's a promise to the hands that built it. And sometimes protecting that promise costs you relationships that were built on sand instead of stone. If they call your firmness cold, remember that steel feels cold too, but it's what holds buildings upright when storms arrive, and storms always arrive for anyone holding something worth taking. Keep your voice steady and your records warmer than your rage. That's the single most important lesson Margaret left me, not in her will, but in her notebooks. In 40 years of choosing documentation over drama and strategy over screaming. After hearing my story, what would you have done in my place? What's your take on protecting what's yours when the people trying to take it are wearing familiar faces and using the word family as a shield? Do you believe boundaries are cold? Or do you think they're the kindest thing you can build when love and manipulation start wearing the same mask? I want to hear your stories, your strategies, your moments when you chose yourself over someone else's comfort. Drop them in the comments, because those stories build the next person's courage, and courage is contagious when it's shared honestly. If you want more stories like this, real inheritance battles, family business betrayals, and quiet strategies that make loud endings without courtroom drama, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what I'm building here isn't just content. It's a community of people who are tired of being told that protecting what's theirs makes them selfish. Next up, we're diving into When Family Business Isn't Family, Turning Pressure into Paper Trails, where I'll walk you through exactly how I documented everything, what apps I used, what mistakes I made, and what legal structures saved me when charm turned to threats. This isn't theory, it's architecture, the kind Margaret taught me to build, and the kind I'm teaching you to recognize before someone hands you blueprints with their name where yours should be. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for trusting me with your time. I'll see you in the next video, and until then, remember, they called it luck, but you and I know better. It was readiness meeting preparation, and the only signature that mattered was the one I never gave them.